Trump now more or less has two options in Iran, which is to concede to their demands, which means withdraw from US power, limited or full from the region, or to escalate. What about your allies? How are they going to respond in a world where the security that was once promised might no longer be guaranteed? The biggest danger, I think, in the world today is not individual actors or people who are trying to do bad things or people who are just stupid. We can deal with that if we have institutions.
There is so much we can learn from history. And when we're considering international risk today, it'd be amiss if we didn't occasionally dive back and look into the past to hopefully learn about the future and maybe even the current. Today, we've got Jake Clapham. He's a history YouTuber who focuses on the intersection between the past and the present. And recently, he's been shooting a documentary in Japan about the causes and consequences of World War II. Jake's also a graduate of politics, philosophy, and economics from the University of Essex. He's got a background in international education. And interestingly, he's also the creator and host of Flashback History. That's a channel dedicated to exploring the darkest moments in history and trying to find out what made those involved do what they did. And I think we're going to have a great conversation today, looking back at the past and comparing that to some of the decisions being made today. Jake, welcome to the International Risk Podcast.
It's a pleasure to be here. Thanks for having me.
Jake, I love some of your content and I'm really excited about our conversation today. But I understand you're on holidays. Whereabouts in the world are you today?
So right now I'm in southern Turkey. I'm visiting some friends here. It's very sunny, but luckily I'm in a nice cool room. So yeah, I'm not usually in Turkey.
Turkey's a beautiful spot. When I look back, and I've been really blessed with a lifetime of adventures. But when I think about some of the happiest adventures I've had, southern Turkey and some of the borderlands along Syria and Lebanon would definitely include that. So do enjoy southern Turkey while you're there for me.
I will.
But when as we touch on the topics of Turkey and Syria and Lebanon and certainly borders in general, when we look over the past, I mean, I love studying history. I think it's amazing. I'm a student of international relations and international law, but one of the things that at least the professors would say to us is the difference between someone who studies in history and someone who studies international relations. The only difference is that the person who studies international relations does the so what does that mean for the future? And when we look back at history and how international relations and how international risk has evolved, it's really been phenomenal. And I think what's made it so phenomenal is the size of some of the catastrophes and just the decision making processes and the miscalculations that have led to it. You've done a lot and spoken a lot about this on your channel. Can you tell us about what are some of the memorable miscalculations that you think of?
In all of history, I mean, there's an endless tapestry of human error there to pick from. Honestly, without any further context, nothing immediately springs to mind because there's just so much to choose from. I think that's part of the tragedy of the human story is that um, although it's quite unfashionable nowadays to sort of subscribe to this great man of history theory, where individuals kind of make and break the wealth and prosperity of nations, they can certainly break them. And there's an endless list of blunders to choose from there.
And you've been recently working on World War II and Japan. Certainly, there was America's reluctance to get involved in the European theatre of the conflict, and then of course Japan's decision to bomb Pearl Harbor, which brought the US. And as I think the Japanese said, they've woken a sleeping giant. Can you tell us about some of the miscalculations that maybe led to the bombing of Pearl Harbor and then some of the miscalculations that occurred after that on all sides of that conflict?
So the quote about sleeping giants, that's actually a misquote that's often attributed to Hirohito, who was more or less against Pearl Harbor, but didn't really have the stomach to go to battle with his military bureaucrats over it. Um, Pearl Harbor is obviously an enormous miscalculation, but I think in a lot of the stories that we focus on and hear about the Second World War, we see Pearl Harbor as the start of Japanese aggression, whereas I think actually it's kind of the swan song of the Japanese Empire. It's the last thing they do before it all goes arse over tit. And when I was in Japan shooting the documentary, I couldn't help but sort of think that we're actually looking at the entirety of the Second World War wrong. And I think it probably started in 1931, if not 1937, which is when Japan first starts kind of meddling about in China, trying to carve off bits of territory. It goes extremely well for the Japanese at first. But by 1938, it comes to a bit of a standstill. And this is when the Japanese military starts acting in a really schizophrenic way. The army wants to go north, the navy wants to go south. They go north, they have a battle, they have a fight with the Russians at Khalkhin Gor that goes terribly. So then they're like, okay, let's go south instead. They go south, they start meddling around in Indochina, which is Vietnam today. And that's when the US says, okay, enough's enough, your oil's off. And Japan doesn't have enough oil to conclude its war with China. So Japan's decision then is to basically just roll the dice, see if they can get the Americans out of the war so they can focus all their efforts on China. It's a completely doomed project. Most of the people knew it. Even those who masterminded the project gave it a 50-50 chance of success. Now, 50-50 chance of success just to buy yourself a few more years in a war you're already losing, to go to war with another superpower who will defeat you if that 50-50 doesn't pay off, is absolutely suicidal. There's no reason or rationale to it. And a lot of the people involved in the Japanese decision making process knew that and went ahead with it anyway. And I think a lot of the ways to understand that is to actually just understand Japanese culture and the way that decisions were made. And I think that's a problem that we'll get onto this later. It's one of the lessons that we can learn definitely is that if you assume that your opponent or your adversary is going to make the same decisions you would in their shoes and is going to use the same process as reasoning as you would, then you're going to have a really bad time.
It's very, very interesting to consider. And you talked earlier about Japan meddling in their neighbours' affairs in the 1930s, carving off bits of territory. I couldn't help but think that if you replaced the country Japan with the word China and talked about the 2010s and the 2020s, you could almost see a potential parallel with China meddling in the affairs of its neighbours, carving off territory with reefs and atolls. The enforcement of a 9 dash line, which cuts across countries like Malaysia, that are going to have to start exploring for oil if they're going to meet their own country's energy needs in what is legally accepted to be their territory, but which China considers its territory. Do you see parallels when you look at what's happening in the South Pacific today?
Absolutely. I think this is a comparison that would upset both the Japanese and Chinese today, but it's almost the same sort of cascade of events. So in 1853, Japan is essentially a feudal kingdom, and they should have had what China had, which was their century of humiliation. Japan didn't. Japan pursued a policy of radical change, of radical modernization. This is the Meiji period, the Meiji Restoration. Everything changes. It's almost impossible actually to overstate how much society changed in just 50 years. So much so that the state of the art military gear was 17th century muskets when the Americans first got there in 1853, and by 1912 around there they'd sunk the entire Russian fleet. So this enormous modernization, social as well as military. What this does, though, is this wakes Japan up. They're like, we are in trouble here. We're in a world of predators. If we don't play our cards right, someone's going to have a chunk of us at some point. And it's this kind of radical paranoia as well as modernization that causes them to start messing about in Manchuria in the 30s. I think China is roughly on the same path. Now, China was unlucky in that it didn't have the enormous success as Japan did in immediate modernization, but it definitely learnt the same lessons as Japan did, which is that the world is a scary place. You need to make yourself powerful before someone else takes advantage of you. And that's what China's doing now. I think it would be naive not to see the world from the Chinese perspective. I think they have a right to be slightly paranoid. What I think the problem is that their own paranoia is going to come to bite them, because the more they antagonize their neighbors, the lonelier they're going to be if push comes to shove, which is what Japan was in. Japan was completely isolated. It had a pact with Germany and Italy, but they didn't really do anything. They run completely separate wars, whereas the Allied powers were all in it together and strategically aligning what they were doing to make sure that it had the most results. Whereas Japan and Germany sort of just fought their own wars. So maybe China will have an ally, I don't know, in Iran, but the chances of them being able to strategically align, should there be a conflict in East Asia, I think are limited.
Yeah, very interesting. I'd like to pick up on that. When we look at Japan in the 1930s, when we looked at the decisions made by the Japanese government and the military to lead to war, Do you see comparisons to what was happening in Germany at the same time with the decisions that were being made in Munich and the decisions after World War One about Germany starting to increase its territory, starting to interfere in the machinations and the territorial land grabs in the late 1930s, and then of course leading into invasions of both Austria but also Belgium and France. Do you see comparisons as to how the World War Two unfolded in the Pacific theater as it also unfolded in Europe, or do you see them as completely separate and completely different?
So they are separate in the sense that there was no sort of conspiracy between them, but they are immensely connected. The imagery I like people who don't think about history much to think about the Second World War is the world's this massive cobweb. And all
Mhm.
these places, Poland's over here and Manchuria's down here. And the more the chaos and this swirl of the lead to the Second World War happens, the closer these objects get. So I want people to imagine you put your hand in the middle of this spider's nest and twist slowly without breaking a thread. And eventually, all these nations that are miles apart start coming really closely together, and the connections become impossible to ignore. Hitler's aggression, really, in Europe was a consequence of the fact that Japan had already broken the League of Nations with its aggression in Manchuria. In fact, I think without Japanese aggression, Germany wouldn't have been able to be as aggressive as it was. For instance, the thing that we think kicked off the Second World War is often said as Hitler's invasion of Poland in 1939. But that was predicated on an alliance with Stalin. And Stalin probably wouldn't have been as keen to make that alliance if he didn't have to worry about what was going on in his eastern border with Japan. So they are very, very, very connected. The other thing to mention as well about Versailles and the post-war settlement. So obviously, World War One is immensely traumatic for the European powers. It's a tremendous waste of life. Even the winners, Britain and France, ended bankrupt and with 1 million dead. Germany had lost 2 million and had to pay some pretty steep reparations and lose some territory for the pleasure of having lost. Whereas Japan lost about 2,000 men in World War One. It got Qingdao, it got the South Marianas Islands, it got all sorts of lovely things for basically nothing. And it was able to massively inflate its economy because allies wanted to buy loads of gear off of the Japanese. After the First World War, however, Japan goes to the Treaty of Versailles and they're like, great, we're going to make all these new colonies legal. We're going to get this settled and we're going to be a world power from now on. We're a member of the club. And at the League of Nations, they have to give up all their stuff because Woodrow Wilson is trying to pursue a liberal policy, right? Of we're all in this club together. It's rules based. No one can be too powerful. That's how we get peace. Whereas Japan's thinking, hang on a minute, 30 years ago, to the winner went the spoils. Now I've got it all. You're saying I have to give it up. And then they say, okay, well, fine, we'll give it up, but can we have a race equality clause? Can you at least admit that fundamentally Japanese people and Asians can be considered equal to Europeans? And even then, they get a no. So they walk out of the Treaty of Versailles grumbling as well as Germany does, although for very different reasons.
Yeah, no, I think that's a really good point, and I think understanding what and how and why these decisions were made is critically important. And I love your example or your analogy of the spider's web, and I'd love to explore and unpack that. When we consider the US and Israel's attacks against Iran and that possible driving force for what might be considered World War III at some point, and what we can learn. When we look at Iranian oil, we look at Iranian drones, which was a huge game changer for Russia. I think we've forgotten that, but how much the Shahid drones that Iran was selling to Russia and the huge impact that had on the war in Ukraine. But then, of course, you've got China's purchase of Iranian oil. You've got Iran's support to Hezbollah in Lebanon and the Houthis in Yemen, which are then attacking parts of Israel and are against Israeli interests. Then you've got Israel's, to use their own government's wording, extreme reprisals against the Lebanese and against the Syrians and against the Yemenis. How does all this fit together when we keep looking at that spider web and bringing all these things close together? And what does that tell us when we look at today's spider web and the interlinkages between Iran, between China? We haven't even talked about India, which is certainly a spider in the middle of that web that's buying weapons from Russia, buying weapons from the East, buying oil from Russia, and then supplying IT services to most of Europe and North America. what does that mean? What should we be sort of taking out? We can all picture that now. I think it's a really great analogy you've drawn for us. So what? What does that mean, and how does that take us forward?
So I'll have to defer to your experience on the Middle East, certainly in current affairs. Um, I have purposefully tried to avoid studying the Middle East too closely. I know how essential it is, but I also know that it's a bit of a sort of rabbit hole that once you get down it, um, it doesn't end at Sykes-Picot, as people often say. You're going to be there forever to try and get a full picture. So please take everything I say with a pinch of salt and feel free to correct me. The broader picture, though, taking out the intricacies of and the peculiars of the situation in the Middle East, Iran clearly holds one of the most strategic assets in the world, which is the Strait of Hormuz. And whatever the regime in Iran happens to be, and whatever state of war happens to be at play, that must be taken seriously. And that will obviously spread its tendrils out to everywhere in the world, particularly those that rely on it. India, as you say, I think is trying to have it both ways. And I think they eventually will probably have to pick a side. I do think sides are emerging. I think that the reason that the US put the second embargo on the Strait of Hormuz was to make sure that Iran basically couldn't choose who it sent its oil to. So if I'm not getting any, no one's getting any. Now, obviously, this is bad news for China, but it's even worse news for Japan or for South Korea, for instance. These nations are going to get really, really anxious soon. Now, Japan has already said that should China make a move on Taiwan, it will be beholden to respond because it would be an existential threat to Japan's interests. I wouldn't be surprised if China saw this energy crisis as a window of opportunity. Because how's Japan going to do anything if it can't get its boats out of its ports because it's got no oil for them? Now, obviously, I don't think that's necessarily what's going to happen. But this essentially destabilizes an already unstable period. And I think even small actors can do really, really silly things sometimes, or do things that essentially set off more and more stuff. I think there's a lot of talk about World War III. There is now currently a conflict in Europe that's been raging for 4 years. There's a conflict now in the Middle East. Should there be a conflict in East Asia, it is basically already a third world war, especially if China's involved in it. As for how we get there from Iran, I'm not entirely sure, but I wouldn't be surprised if future historians looked at this and the energy crisis that it produces as a major contributing factor to the outbreak of further hostilities, especially in East Asia.
Jake, I think so many of the things you've said have rung true, and it's really interesting to look and we do a tour of the globe when we look at a lot of these issues. But I think, as I often say when I'm working with clients, is when we see things at that geopolitical level, when we see Trump and Putin and Xi and Modi and others make these big statements on the international stage, these flow down. They flow down to information collection, to sabotage, to hybrid warfare, to intelligence collection, but they also critically flow down into domestic policies, the policies that affect all of us, whether it's our colleagues in the Philippines and Indonesia that are paying for it painfully at the petrol pump, or whether it's inflation at the supermarket or our farmers in the fields with a lack of fertilizer. But if we go back to the 1930s, can you talk to us about the domestic policies and how they drove the international risk that led us into World War II?
Domestic politics, rather than policies, let's say, domestic politics massively shape foreign policy, particularly in democracies where people have a say over who rules them and what the kind of the ticket is. Um, so to that extent, they can't be ignored in any sense of the word. I think though that we need to be careful about putting the cart before the horse here. So I think a lot of these leaders, especially in democratic nations, who come out and say these massive things on the international stage that can sometimes be quite inflammatory or unexpected or interesting, oftentimes are more trying to appeal to their own voters than they are trying to send a message to the rest of the world. And I think behind closed doors is where a lot of the threats are actually made. No one wants to appear ugly in public. So the quality of discourse in any democratic nation is going to be massive for the chances of further escalation, of silly wars, wars of folly, miscalculations. I think Donald Trump is a fantastic example of this. But I will get on to Germany, don't worry. But I think Donald Trump is a fantastic example of this in that, and actually, it's an interesting quirk for all US presidents, is that the more they try and run on an anti war ticket, the more they end up in wars. Woodrow Wilson, famously re elected in 1916, goes to war in 1917, promises no wars. FDR promises no wars. Bush runs on a domestic ticket, ends up in Iraq. Trump, no more forever wars, America first. Here we are with Iran. It's an interesting little quirk. Um, as for Germany, so Germany's a weak, a difficult example. So I do think we definitely need to look closely at the lessons of Germany, and I think that most people understand them roughly. Hitler comes into politics after the First World War. He's a fiery speaker. He joins the German Workers' Party, turns it into the Nazi Party, tries to overthrow the government in 1923, goes to prison for it, writes a book, gets released, becomes relatively popular, but certainly doesn't steamroll any elections, and then is able to kind of cough and wheeze his way into power after the death of Ludendorff. I think it's Ludendorff. I always get him and the other one mixed up. Um, so I don't think really that we can draw strong parallels between today and the rise of Adolf Hitler in the 1930s. The parallels that do exist, though, are that we have extreme political bifurcation, a feeling of loss within nations. People have this grievance, this feeling that they're not going to be better in 10 years than they were 10 years ago. And we often talk past one another, and we treat relatively minor social issues as existential threats. So the classic example would be the trans debate. Now, whether or not, it doesn't really matter what side of the trans debate that you're on, but I think the debate itself gets way more attention than it actually existentially represents for anyone, realistically. Conservatives are not going to die if trans people have rights. You could argue trans people are in trouble if they don't have any, but as long as the liberal democracies hold, they should be protected anyway. Um, through laws like freedom of expression and so on. I think these debates essentially distract us from what's actually going on in the world. And I think politicians often rely on those debates to pick up their supporters. Why am I talking about this? Why does it matter? Because um, these debates themselves have become so toxic that it's almost impossible to sit next to someone who thinks the other thing without assuming that they're necessarily a terrible person. And once you think that way, it's really a hop, skip, and a jump to thinking that we're better off without them, or that they should have less rights, or that it's worth having a fight over. Which is exactly what happened in Germany in the 30s. We totally miss out the fact that there was like regular street level violence that was politically charged over stupid stuff now that doesn't seem to really even warrant people spilling blood. People weren't fighting over the Treaty of Versailles. They were fighting over silly things like opening times of clubs in Berlin and stuff like that.
Yeah, it's really interesting. And I think when we talk about fighting and what people are fighting about, when we look at diplomacy, when we look at uh, the ability to avoid conflict, I don't think it's necessarily a matter of being tough or being right. I think it's more about whether the threats that are made, whether our commitments to alliances, whether our capability to enforce what we say we're going to enforce is really there, and whether we have the political will, both our politicians, but also in democracies, the people behind us. And then, of course, whether our allies and our adversaries are buying into that. And I think that was potentially, and I'm keen to hear your thoughts about whether that fed into the deterrence ahead of World War II, and whether that fed into the decisions made by Germany and Japan about credibility, alliances, and I guess the diplomatic conversations going on at the time.
So I think we're almost onto the broader question of international institutions here, aren't we? Um, Definitely. So the First World War, I think, is characterized by the fact that there were no institutions. It was just great power politics. The Second World War is characterized by collapse of institutions, but the world was more or less aligned. You had the three big parties, which was this radical sort of fascism and militarism. You had communism, and then you had old world liberal democracy. And it was the old world really that were trying to enforce these institutions, and they were trying to run these institutions as a deterrent. And the fascist powers saw through it, and so did the communists actually, because they got kicked out of the League of Nations when they invaded Finland. So the domestic trust is so important in these institutions. Nobody likes institutions. They're big, they're boring, they're bureaucratic, they make rules. Wouldn't we be better without them? But they're actually so essential. And institutions rely on domestic support so that they can project power onto the international stage. Um, I do worry today that we are seeing a complete collapse in institutions. And I'll betray my political beliefs here. I'm horrified when leaders like Trump openly and brazenly say things like NATO's a paper tiger. America, I think, would like a dictatorship, these kinds of things. Is this anti institutionalism, this belief that decisions can be more or less made alone and that the international community can be a sort of state of lawlessness. I think the Third World War, should it occur, will look much like the First World War, in that there are very few ideological differences, or there are very few arguments about what the world should look like ideologically and socially. And I think it will be much more of just a kind of a great power spat where it's purely competition for resources and prestige, which means it will probably, I mean, you could argue the First World War didn't end until 1991. So I would say World War III, I don't think it's going to be a sort of flash in the pan for 3 or 4 years and then we'll all get back to our business once we figure out who's survived. I think it will very likely lead to a long period of conflict, of security anxiety, of violence. And I think the only way really we have left to make sure that doesn't happen is to try as best we can to restore trust in institutions domestically and restore their sort of robust power internationally.
And I think that robust power is critical. I mean, NATO itself says that Russia's illegal war against Ukraine is the gravest threat to the Euro-Atlantic security in decades. And the word credible and effective deterrence is doing so much work around Brussels and European capitals today. And I think Russia and Vladimir Putin is rightly watching whether Europe can sustain Ukraine at the same time as building the European defense industrial base, which has been gutted since the early 90s, especially now that we see the US pulling out. CIPRI and other organizations, and we had a great interview with CIPRI a couple of weeks ago on the podcast, and I encourage our listeners to go back and listen to that. They've done a lot of great research, and defense spending is up across the Indo-Pacific region, across Europe. But again, that's very different to actual deterrence. And in the same way that I think Ukraine is perhaps a credibility test for NATO and for Europe, I think Taiwan is another credibility test. I mean, Taiwan's parliament just recently approved their extra defense spending, which I think is largely seen as good news, but they only approved 25 billion rather than the 40 billion that was proposed. And I think this difference itself is really important because it speaks to Taiwan's willingness to demonstrate that it's willing to invest in its own defense, that it's its own deterrence against potential aggression from its neighbors. So I wonder, when you think about credibility and deterrence and robustness in 2026, do you think we've got the balance right, especially when we're seeing such mixed messages from the president of Finland, the chancellor of Germany, and the president of the USA, who are all meant to be allies, but using very different language?
No, I don't think we. I think if you excuse the foul language, I think we need to get our shit together. Um, if you took a look, I think this is the thing that people often misread as well about sort of signaling deterrence, um, institutions, and international cooperation. So yes, it's very easy to think, oh well, if our enemies don't take us seriously, maybe they'll have a war with us, maybe they won't, maybe we'll win it, maybe we won't. That's fine. That's a conversation that we can have as well. But you've also got to think about your allies. How are they going to respond in a world where the security that was once promised might no longer be guaranteed, where the institutions they relied on to ally themselves with you are no longer guaranteed? So Taiwan's a great example. If you were Taiwan right now, would you be confident that the Western powers would intervene should there be some aggression on your land? And so is the best strategy then really to invest all of this money knowing that your allies might not even meet you for the fight? The Gulf states are another fantastic example. I know this isn't about institutional breakdown, but I mean, Trump now more or less has two options in Iran, which is to concede to their demands, which means a withdrawal from US power, limited or full from the region, or to escalate, which means that Other states in the Gulf are going to receive yet more punishment. So either way, he's alienated the region. Institutions would have stopped this from happening in the first place, domestic and international. So yes, they're no longer functioning. I think we run the risk of not just encouraging our adversaries to have a pop at us, but encouraging our allies to maybe consider re-examining their loyalties, and that would be a crying shame because for all of the criticisms you could make of the US-led world order from 1945, with its folly in Vietnam and the violence and the prop up of right-wing dictatorships in South America, with all of that included, I think and still believe that the US has, on balance, been a force for good in the world. And I don't want to live in a world where a liberal US led world order is not the norm. I think people have taken it massively for granted on both sides of the debate. I think it's a crying shame. I don't even know if it is fixable. Because I think at this point, if you were to try and restore faith in these institutions to make them powerful again, I think our adversaries may well see it as a sign of aggression and not of a return to status quo, which could further inflame the possibilities of more hostilities elsewhere. It's a real tightrope. We've got ourselves into a situation where there are very few good choices remaining. And I'm scared that those who are in the positions to make decisions don't feel this way. And even if they did, wouldn't necessarily have the nous to try and pull things back together. I mean, if you when we were looking at Japan earlier, I know I'm going on a bit, but when we were looking at Japan earlier, they've already lost this war in China, or they've fought it to such a stalemate that they need to sort of punch elsewhere to open up a new front to get a new opportunity. The last thing Japan needed was another fight, but they went for it anyway because they felt that the international institutions are weak and it led to a world war in the Pacific. Sorry, it led to the world war reaching the Pacific. Um, Nowadays, I mean, if Putin felt that the war in Ukraine was no longer politically sustainable, that the sort of the deadlock and the grind had reached a point where he needed to get some more results, I could see him marching 5 miles into Estonia, stopping at the nearest river and saying, okay, then, are we going to have it? Are you going to do Article 5 over this tiny stretch of land here? And if he doesn't, then he may feel he's broken NATO and he may feel that he can ignore the previously accepted norms of warfare. So he might deploy, say, tactical nuclear weapons in Ukraine, not the big city destroyers, the small ones that are used to take out bases and hangars and stuff like that. So the more these international institutions peel away, the more opportunities there are for both friend and foe to degrade them further. And to answer the original question, we are nowhere near where we need to be to make sure that these possibilities are no longer on the cards.
And so, if we speak to people that can make decisions, we've got business leaders that listen to the podcast all over Europe, the UK, North America. So, for those business leaders, I think the same logic applies, but at a very different level. I mean, companies operating in 2026 simply cannot assume that their states, their governments are going to absorb any geopolitical or international risk for them. You know, whether we're talking about supply chains, travel, cyber exposure, sanctions, China dependency, executive risk, disinformation, organized crime, infrastructure disruption, hybrid warfare. The list goes on and on, Jake. So why should business leaders care about this? You know, why is this topic important to them, and what are some of the things that they should be thinking about?
Business leaders, in at least in the West, work in a maritime system. That maritime system depends on international cooperation and international trade. You need to know that if you're going to go and visit one of your factories or one of your partners in South Korea or the Philippines, your credit card's going to work, for instance. Um, in a system where trust between nations degrades and where institutions that regulate finance are paralyzed, the ability for you to even use the resources that you may have accrued are gone. And on a more fundamental level, great power wars. So in small wars, negligible, maybe avoidable, but great power conflicts between peers, Russia US conflict, a US China conflict, even a US Iran conflict, should it continue. These are just bad for business. Hormuz has been the best example of this that everyone can see. It's just so bad for business. So not only does international trade collapse, but consumer economies shrink as well because everyone has less money and everyone's scared. So unless you're literally making stuff that's good for the war economy, like drones, defenses, strategic infrastructure, stuff like that, chances are a war is really, really bad news for you, even if you're trading domestically. This is the tragedy of great power conflicts. When they go to war, all areas of human flourishing are temporarily put on hold in order to fund and sustain the war effort. And that would include the largest company to a farmer in a field with a scythe. Everyone sort of has to just put aside what they were doing and focus on the war. Wars are bad in the first place. No one wants to focus on them in the best of times. You especially don't want to focus on them if you're in the middle of trying to achieve some aim for your business. On the flip side, though, business leaders do have influence. You might not feel like it. It might not feel like you have that much influence, particularly if you're a medium or on the smaller side of a large business. But compared to the average voter, you certainly do have more resources. You do have more networks. You have some local authority in your community. You're a place where workers gather, at least, and you may have some political access. So although it may be tempting to look past a leader who has some pretty sour opinions, but is going to promise short term corporation tax cuts or something like that that's good for your business, you're never going to be able to taste the fruits of that if your country is in a major war. At the end of the day, the system of international capitalism that we enjoy, that means that I go to bed warm every night and that my internet works in the morning and that the milk comes to my door cold and hasn't gone off, that is a product of stability, and that's the thing I think we all need to protect right now.
Very much. Jake, just in the last 30 seconds, I wonder, we ask all the guests on the International Risk podcast, what are the international risks that concern them the most? But I'd also love to hear from you. What are the warning signs? What are the risk triggers that you're watching most closely right now?
So I don't have access to any information that your average news outlet wouldn't have and wouldn't be able to explain just as well as me. So I'm watching the same things that everyone else is. What I'm thinking about more broadly, though, what actually does keep me up at night, I am watching Donald Trump closely to see if there are any further attacks on international domestic institutions, and if the US is likely to recover institutionally, whether or not you like him, institutionally recover. Um, I'm watching Hormuz to see what happens there and with the Iran escalation. I'm watching Ukraine. There's a lot of talk now amongst Ukrainian soldiers that the line may break this year, which would be terrible news. Now, obviously, this is just from soldiers that have come back and been interviewed, especially international soldiers. Dominic, you may disagree, but I am watching Ukraine quite closely to see if there's any developments there, because either way, that's going to be enormous. And obviously, China and Taiwan. Any military movement or activity would be really globally significant. And I think that if they did come to blows, that would more or less be the final nail in the coffin of it being a third world war. What I want people, if you're asking, if you're asking if I can boil down everything I've just said, because I know I've not been particularly eloquent today, is that the biggest danger I think in the world today is not individual actors or people who are trying to do bad things or people who are just stupid. We can deal with that if we have institutions, and right now we don't. That was what, if I had to summarize the outbreak of the Second World War in a sentence, it would be the collapse of international institutions, and that's exactly what's happening now.
Mm. Yeah, no, I definitely agree with you. Whether it was the collapse of the League of Nations, leading ahead of the World War II, but then of course, yeah, the lack of power that the United Nations and other intra government bodies have today, I think that is very very concerning. But yes, I think all your analysis is very interesting. I'm not sure I agree on the Ukraine point, but that's part of the enjoyment of these discussions about hearing other people's perspectives. But yeah, I'll be in Ukraine again shortly, and I look forward to seeing what it's like on the ground again. But Jake, I really appreciate.
I really hope you're right. By the way, again, this is just something I got from a couple of soldiers who were interviewed. And just to make my point one last time before we say goodbye, if you're in any doubt about institutions, the period between 1945 and 2008 was the most peaceful time we had in our lives, and that was governed by international institutions. They really do make a difference. Sorry, I had to get that in.
No, I'm glad you did, Jake. No, thank you very much for that. Yeah, and to your other point, I often, quite often, preface things with, "And I hope I'm wrong." I really hope I'm wrong. But sadly, in the hugely volatile and demanding environment we're in, sadly, a lot of the things we're looking at do turn out to be correct. But it was a great conversation, and I'm really glad we had you on the International Risk podcast today, Jake.
It's a pleasure to be here. Thanks for enduring my ramblings.
Very interesting. Well, that was a great conversation with Jake Clapham. He's a history YouTuber who focuses on the intersection between the past and the present, and I really enjoyed our conversation today. Today's podcast was produced and coordinated by Keir Fairley. I'm Dominic Bowen, your host. Thanks very much for listening. We'll speak again in the next couple of days.